Good afternoon. My name is Nir. I teach in the philosophy department here, and I run the Applied Ethics Center. This meeting, this talk, is part of our Artificial Intelligence and Experience series. And this afternoon, we are very lucky to have my friend and colleague, Jay Hughes. Jay will be talking about algorithms and post-human governance. I'll say a few words about Jay and then hand it over to him. Jay Hughes is a bioethicist and a sociology research fellow at the UMass Boston Center for Applied Ethics and as the associate provost for institutional research assessment and planning. Jay has a doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago, where he taught bioethics at the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. And since then, he has taught health policy, bioethics, medical sociology, and research methods at Northwestern, the University of Connecticut, and Trinity College. He's the author of a seminal book in the area of technology and post-human policy, Citizen Cyborg, Why Democratic Societies Must Respond to the Redesigned Human of the Future. And he's also an editor or co-editor of Surviving the Machine Age, Intelligent Technology, and the Transformation of Human Work from 2017. In 2005, he co-founded the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies with the Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom, and since then he has served as its executive director. Jay serves as an associate editor of the journal Evolution and Technology and as co-founder of the Journal of Post-Human Studies. He is also fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of Humanity Plus, the Neuroethics Society, the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, and the Working Group on Ethics and Technology at Yale University. So without further ado, Jay, thanks for agreeing to do this.
Sure.
And
do I have good levels? Excellent. So 15 years ago, I was the executive director of an outfit called the World Transhumanist Association. And anybody know what transhumanism is? Basically advocacy for human enhancement technologies and the prospects of human enhancement. And this organization was global, and the fights, the internal political fights, because being for human enhancement technology is a pretty minimum set of agreements. And so we had far-right people, we had libertarian people, lots of libertarian people, we had lots of left-wing people. And we couldn't agree about very much in terms of policy because of these disagreements. So Bostrom and I and a group of other left-leaning transhumanists and people who were in our orbit, fellow travelers of transhumanism who didn't want to apply the ism to themselves, we started the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and its raison d'etre was to promote what we call the TechnoProgressive Perspective on public policy, which are taking seriously future technologies, emerging technologies that most public policy does not yet take seriously or considers science fictional, but also critiquing as vociferously as we can the conservative and libertarian strains of futurism which tend to advantage already advantaged people in the world. And so one of the colleagues that we recruited, John Danaher, is a brilliant Irish legal philosopher, and he started about 5 years ago writing about algocracy, the potential rule by algorithms. And I think John is actually quite sophisticated in his analysis, but his perspective, what brought him into contact with, with lots of critics of technology, which had a quite different perspective, the kind of perspective that we in the techno-progressive circles tend to critique. That is, they tended to see algorithms as something startlingly new and potentially quite bad for democracy, for civil liberties, and so forth. But the first techno-progressive question that I usually ask when I'm looking at a new topic is this really new and different? How new and different are the technological affordances that are being critiqued as potentially quite damaging? I think these are all serious questions. The expansion of surveillance in an algorithmic state, the expansion of consumer profiling, the use of our big data for Capitalist Purposes, the new book out, Surveillance Capitalism by Zuboff. An example of that, the opacity of algorithmic decision making. I'll talk about all these. The displacement of human discretion and so forth, and even the idea that algorithms and AI might take off and have an autonomy of its own, which would be hostile to human beings. And the kind of cyber criticism I'm thinking of, Yevgeny Morozov is one good example of this. But what I realized, I got invited to give a talk to the IEEE electrical engineers about cybernetics. And I began to think about this problematic and wrote a paper about it if you're curious. And my basic argument as a social scientist is that at least in regards to the question of algorithmic governance, that the actual thing that we're looking at is rules. We're looking at whether you have rules to govern society or not and how those rules get governed themselves. And rules go back a long, long way. An eye for an eye, if a man destroy the eye of another, then he shall have his eyes destroyed. That's an algorithmic rule. It's eye for an eye. Now this is an example of algorithmic discrimination. If one destroy the eye of a freeman or break the bone of a freeman, he shall pay 1 gold mina, and if one destroys the eye of a slave, then you only have to pay half that much. So that's written into the law quite explicitly, literally carved in stone. There is this discrimination between freeman and slave in the Code of Hammurabi. But these are ancient ways of getting over the problem of having every cop or every tax accountant or every person that you meet in the state have a different interpretation of what the general rules are supposed to be. Bureaucracies are an attempt to make rules universal, consistent, hopefully impartial. They've never really functioned that way. The state has always had its partialities, its ways of being suborned by private interests. But to the extent that you can, bureaucracies are supposed to increase the legitimacy of the state by creating these efficiencies. Rules generally beat no rules. They make biases more explicit. They make decisions faster. And some of this comes from, for instance, Weber. Weber was very insistent that the bureaucratization of life was one of the dynamics, inescapable dynamics of modern life. And that it had lots of advantages, and he thought it had some disadvantages as well, which his disadvantages aren't as relevant to this talk. Now, if algorithms are in fact codifications into silicon or into computers of the rules that govern firms or states, then we can think about these in a very different way. Law is a set of if-then conclusions about crimes and their punishments. We have classification schemes. The law is full of attempts. My favorite is the case where they tried to figure out whether statues of the X-Men that were being imported for tax purposes were dolls depicting human beings or dolls depicting animals. And there was a huge debate about this because the whole point of the X-Men is that you don't have to be human to be a member of the human society, blah, blah, blah. But the law is full of these kinds of classification schemes. Feedback loops, if you have too much of X, then you apply some of Y. Recommendations, if you like X, you'll probably like Y. Price setting, if supply is X, then set the price at Y. These are all a series of rules in organizations. And the reason I have natural-born cyborgs up there is that Andy Clark makes similar points about when did we become cyborgs. And his point is that we became cyborgs as soon as we were capable of downloading the contents of our thoughts onto external storage media, that is with literacy, and uploading it again later. That literacy is the cyborg moment. And so the creation of these rules and saying we're not going to rely on the impermanence of human memory and the inconstancy of human affections for the state, we're going to actually have these as rules. Now, with the Enlightenment, there were memes in the Enlightenment about reason and science and rationality coming to govern society. And one of the ways that those memes were interpreted by the enlightened or Enlightenment monarchs of the time, like Catherine the Great, was to take a good look at bureaucracy and try to reform it, to try to have modern, consistent, trustable bureaucracy. And in some ways, Hegel is an exemplar of the height of this tradition in the Enlightenment, arguing that the Prussian bureaucracy was in some ways the height of human accomplishment. And you can look at utopian novels of the 19th century, like Looking Backward, where Edward Bellamy argued that because of the bureaucratic trends of modern society, eventually we would end up in a socialist, bureaucratic version of socialism in which everyone would have a job and so forth, and it would just be a natural evolution. And the Fabians and Schumpeter and other people have argued this kind of convergence. And then there have been people who have explicitly argued for technocracy. But this theme of how can we make states rational? Should states be rational in the first place? And we can see the whole rise of authoritarian far-right politics right now as in some ways a reaction against the assertion of elite technocratic knowledge. So in some ways it's an ongoing conversation, but this enthusiasm for making the state more rational and consistent has been throughout the last 200 years of history. Now, algorithmic fairness, as with bureaucratic fairness, is of course an ongoing issue. We have seen, for instance, studies of judges. I think this was actually in Israel, wasn't it? Near the study of judges that judges right before lunch and the hour before lunch, they gave much harsher sentences than those after lunch, that basically being a hangry judge is not a good thing to face. We see substantial evidence of human bias in hiring, diagnoses, grading, peer review, dating, housing decisions, policing, and so forth. So racial biases, other kinds of biases, gender biases, written into the way that humans do all these things. And part of the hope is that bureaucratic or algorithmic ways of doing these things might overcome these human biases. Here it says, meta-analysis of hiring algorithms found them to be 50% better than humans at picking the best job applicants. And you can find this kind of data. Every day my inbox fills up with diagnostic algorithms that, computers are better at diagnosing cancers and all kinds of conditions now than doctors are themselves. Now, the problem as we have put these algorithms into place, for instance, with sentencing and parole hearings, the use of algorithms to determine recidivism rates, we find that they have written into themselves various kinds of racial and other biases. If you live in a racist society where it's significantly harder for African American ex-cons to find subsequent employment than white ex-cons, then you're going to have a society where there's a higher recidivism rate for African Americans. And so just using that data, as we have seen frequently with attempts to train AI off of actual existing data sets, the Tay, I think it was called, example of a chatbot that was trained off of Twitter and immediately became a racist troll and so forth, that there are biases written into the world of the internet, and when you build data sets off of them, they often reflect those biases. Now, a deep dive into the way that Florida was using algorithmic sentencing showed that actually they not only had the biases of the fact that there were higher recidivism rates for African Americans built into their recommendations, but that they had added on in some typically opaque Floridian way additional penalties for being African American in Florida. That's the ProPublica analysis that I referenced there at the bottom. So we obviously need algorithmic transparency, but to say that is the same as saying we need bureaucratic transparency. We want the agencies of the state, we want the rules of the state to be as transparent as possible so that we can hold them accountable and identify the places in which they are not efficient or fair and make them as efficient and fair as possible. In the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, which allows citizens to petition for access to government records, is an example of an attempt to incorporate algorithmic or bureaucratic transparency into the democratic process. And to the extent that we can do that, that will ameliorate some of these issues. Now, another reason why I'm interested in this topic is that I'm very interested in the problem of bureaucracy itself in society. I'm not so much interested in the Weberian critique, which is that it leads to a rationalization of life and so forth. But I'm more interested in the kind of Bakunian critique, which is that the argument between Marx and Bakunin in the First International was that the anarchists argued that bureaucracies would have interests of their own, and in fact, the history of bureaucratic collectivism does in fact show that they do. And Marx arguing, no, if you just had bureaucracy controlled by the people in whatever shape that comes about, then it would be a good bureaucracy, not a bad bureaucracy. But I'm interested in, is it possible that bureaucrats themselves may shrink in the future that we're thinking about? One of the things that we've interestingly seen since the 2008 financial crisis is that usually in the 20th century, at least since the 1930s, government employment and military recruiting have been counter-cyclical impacts on the economy in periods of economic downturn. That basically the government hires more workers and sometimes goes to war. We haven't seen that. There's actually been a decline in the OECD countries in the proportion of populations employed by state, federal, local governments. And as a consequence, one of the questions we need to ask is something happening systematically to government employment that might reflect a shrinking of the opportunity for that kind of work in the state, and therefore might represent the algorithmicization or technological unemployment of government employees. And we can see this in a lot of different areas. We can see it in the Postal Service, a dramatic decline in Postal Service employment over the last couple decades, which gave us partly the phrase going postal because people got so annoyed about the insecurity that they were facing. We see an automation of, fortunately for the IRS, which is systematically underfunded in a capitalist country, because we don't want to actually find the wealth that we could. But fortunately, the IRS is now able to, through electronic collection of data and electronic parsing of that data, automatically detect who needs to be audited, who needs extra taxes to be filed, and so forth. And as I said, we've seen the introduction of algorithms in policing, and in criminal justice, and in the U.S. military, which projects that it will have a shrinking of its man force, but a dramatic increase in its use of robotics and drones. We've seen an automation of the law. One of the tasks in a lot of law firms that used to take enormous armies of paralegals was the process of discovery. If you sue a firm and you say, give me everything that you've ever written on X, it used to come in a bunch of big truck with a bunch of boxes, and it would take a fleet of paralegals or lawyers to go through it for months and eventually find the things that you want. Now that arrives in a flash drive, you plug it in, your AI does the work, and you don't have to rely on any human beings anymore. We have law firms that give you templates for filling out your will, that give you templates for having a housing contract, and so forth. There's artificial intelligence being applied to the profiling of juries, to smart contracts, which I don't even understand, but somehow connected to blockchain, so I have to figure that out. And even legal chatbots, which know enough to do things like get you off from a parking ticket. They know the arguments that you can make, and legal chatbots have had enormous success in getting people off of parking tickets. Now, again, all of these kinds of tools have authoritarian possibilities, and we live in a moment of a rise of right-wing authoritarianism around the world threatening democracy. And so, of course, we have to pay attention to the ways that artificial intelligence can surveil, detect, predict deviance, as I'll talk about in China in a second. The dynamic manipulation of news. We now have deep fakes, so that you can put people's images and make it look as if there's a video of them when there actually wasn't a video of them saying or doing something. There's the public shaming, the gamification of behavior, again, something I'll talk about in China. And the use of robot cops and soldiers, which is, I think, misinterpreted as an issue, but I'll get to that in a second. The social media mining that went on during the 2016 campaign probably wasn't as impactful as some would have thought, but it has enormous, I think, possibility in the future to collect big data, especially in our free market wild west of big data aggregation in the United States, but to collect it, put together profiles of people and directly target AI-generated propaganda at them in order to influence their consumer behavior, their political behavior. This is a form of HyperNudging, which is a term that Karen Young has created. Nudging, ordinary nudging is when like the example that she uses, a speed bump is an ordinary nudge. It says, when you're coming through here, if you don't want your axles to give out, slow down before you go through this intersection. GPS, she says, is a hyper nudge. GPS it monitors every foot that you move, and if you go off course a foot or two, it redirects and tells you how to get where you need to go next, and tells, turn left here, turn right here. So to the extent that states have big data and can begin nudging in an increasingly, like I get a letter every year from the Social Security Administration tells me how much I earned, how much taxes I paid, and how much I'm going to get back as a consequence. They're kind of trying to nudge me to be a good citizen, pay my taxes, report my income to the state, and then I'll get a better Social Security when I retire. But if they were doing that on a more regular basis, it might have more impact. And of course, one of the big issues in economic impacts of things like tax cuts. Now, as I mentioned, China's Sesame credit score system, I think, is one of the most shocking and worrying examples of the application of algorithmic governance. And again, just to reiterate my overall point here, from a techno-progressive perspective, I would argue, the problem with a place like China is not that they have access to artificial intelligence tools. I fully support Google workers who decide that they don't want to work for the creation of a new form of totalitarianism in China, if that's the moral line that they want to draw. But the real problem is that China is a totalitarian country. And totalitarian countries will use whatever tools they have at their disposal in totalitarian ways. Capitalist democratic countries like us will allow the capitalist democratic use of tools in whatever ways are possible and have other opportunities for resistance. So I'm not critiquing the use of the tool. I'm critiquing the totalitarian use of the tool, which is shocking, which is that they are aggregating consumer data about debt worthiness, which we have here in the States, with information about how you spend your time, what kinds of activities you spend your time on, if you do too much gaming, if you spend more time with your kids, if you're single versus married, if you're employed versus not, and who your friends are and what you say online and what your friends say online. So connecting your social network to the social network of your friends so that your personal social credit score can be impacted by your friends critiquing the state. And once your social media score falls below certain levels, you're less likely to be able to get a government loan for a home, for instance. You're less likely to be able to get a visa, travel by air. There's all kinds of advantages and disadvantages to participate, and it's mandatory, participating in the Sesame credit score system. So again, a system of surveillance and nudging, hyper-nudging, gamification of social obedience that we couldn't have imagined before artificial intelligence, but not, if you compare it to the Cultural Revolution, I mean, basically your neighbors were watching for any signs of deviance and would invite you to a struggle session and beat the crap out of you if they suspected you of anything. So here it's kind of in that way, it's kind of neoliberal totalitarianism because it's really about you and your behavior, right? And you can take responsibility for it. It's not just the suspicions of your neighbors that because you have glasses or have a PhD, you might be a counter-revolutionary. So in some ways, an advance over what they used to do. Automating the rules of war. We're going to have Ron Arkin come and speak, and one of the arguments that Ron has made is that in the fog of war, it's really hard to get soldiers to pay attention to or to execute the rules of war, and that it may be possible to have robots, lethal autonomous robots in the field, be programmed with the rules of war. Don't shoot children, parse who's a combatant and a non-combatant, take as few casualties as possible, and so forth. to have those rules programmed into machines. And this, I think, is an empirical question. Is it possible? We have to see, how many casualties. And the counterfactual is not, in my mind, whether to have war or not have war. If that's the counterfactual, then yes, let's not have war. Let's have no situations in which people have to be shot. But if there are going to be situations in which people have to be shot, in which we have to have wars or semi-wars, then the question is, what's the best way to go about shooting them and not shooting the people that you don't want to shoot? And I think that's the counterfactual that we have to test with lethal autonomous robotics, is to what degree will they actually be better than human soldiers at carrying out the rules of war? Now, this, I think, is the most extreme of the concerns, and it's one that I share with my colleagues, that there could be a possibility of self-willed superorganisms of AI that act out in ways that we don't expect. And they don't necessarily have to be self-willed. If you've read Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, he argues that, in fact, telling a robot to do something when you think you know exactly what you want it to do could be just as dangerous, because if it tries to do those things in ways you didn't anticipate, then it could lead to catastrophe. The famous paperclip example is one he offers, where he argues that if you told a computer to build lots of paper clips and you didn't specify accurately the conditions, it would turn the planet into paper clips. Now, I think in most circumstances, we would catch those kinds of errors pretty quickly and fix them. But what I'm trying to point out with this slide is to say there have always been situations where some people think something expresses the will of the people and others are pretty sure it does not. The church, democracy, the Communist Party, and in this case, AI. Now, the question is, as an AI government or AI in governance, would that be out of control? Would we be able to tell if it's out of control? I think this is perhaps a place where we get very anxious. The kind of conspiratorial tinge of politics kind of merges with the AI tinge, which is, it might be possible in the future that AIs would be so smart that they would be able to manipulate us if they had motivations or ends of their own, manipulate us in ways that we wouldn't even understand. But this is, again, something that's been true of human beings all along, right? Human beings have always had conspiracies, elite conspiracies, and those elite conspiracies have not come to light often for many centuries, if ever. And so I don't think this is terribly different, the idea that AI might have agendas of its own. It's something that we definitely want to take a serious look at if we ever put AIs that have the capacity for self-will into positions of authority. I don't think that it's a good idea to do so. If, however, we face AI threats, and so, for instance, the Brookings Foundation, last year they did a survey of Americans and they asked them about lethal autonomous robotics and drones, and they said, do you think they're a good idea? And the majority of Americans said they didn't think they were a good idea. And then they said, well, what if China gets them? And then they said, well, then we think it's a good idea, because you don't want to not have the military tools to defend yourself that others have. We're going to be in a future where it's not just cyber criminals, and it's not just cyber terrorists, and it's not just hostile foreign powers. It's the random stuff that will emerge in the ecosystem of the internet, the kind of mysteries of the net that will emerge. I think of it as like the tunnel systems under a city getting infested with rats and alligators or whatever other forms of life. You know, it's not necessarily the Terminator storming through and trying to take over your society. It's not necessarily Russian wolves, you know, running through your sewers and then grabbing all your gold. It could be just the random stuff that we have to defend against, the viruses and so forth, that become increasingly self-aware. In order to have security in that future, we basically use a thief to catch a thief, because the only way to really stay on top of artificial intelligence crime or artificial intelligence security is to have artificial intelligence tools that can stay on top of it for you. So we're going to be forced one way or another into a situation where we have artificial intelligence as a part of our policing arsenal. Now, to quickly address a couple of points about economics, I don't hold a brief for a planned economy, but since I was addressing a conference originally about cybernetics, and there were a lot of Russians in the audience, I decided to make a little detour into the Soviet cybernetic experience. And it's fascinating to me because I consider dialectical thinking to be total hogwash and basically mysticism. And the fact that Marx and Engels studiously ignored natural selection and that later socialists were not interested in things like cybernetics has always puzzled me. But it took the Soviets a while. Cybernetics got going in the United States in the 1950s. And then by the late 50s, the Soviets had decided, you know what? What they're working on there, that could be the key to really making our planned economy work. If we had a model of all the feedback loops in an economy and had all the data to actually determine it. And when they started to get excited about cybernetics in the Soviet Union, they set up a bunch of cybernetic institutes. US intelligence got really worried because they thought, you know, they've made such incredible progress under Stalin and in the 1950s that with this new cybernetics thing, they really could make this planned economy thing work. And they told the intelligence chiefs told Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson that we had to really do our own cybernetics effort and try to figure out how we could use cybernetics in the same way that the Soviets were. And the joke was that Soviet cybernetics was really going nowhere. It was simply a slogan that they had put on top of their economy, principally because there weren't any computers yet. The computers were rare. Most of the Soviet cybernetics institutes that were established never had a computer. There was an estimate that it would take more than 5 years to gather all the data to put into a computer model of the Soviet economy to generate a 5-year plan. So by the time you generated your 5-year plan, it would be obsolete. So the cybernetic control of the Soviet economy never really worked. And since the 1930s, there have been Austrian economists, libertarian economists, who have made the argument that it could never work. It could never work because markets are a more efficient way to aggregate information under capitalism than any kind of bureaucratic administrative mechanism could possibly do under socialism, under a planned economy. Now, that may have been true in the past. I think, in fact, it was true. I think that's one of the explanations for why Soviet and then Chinese, I mean, the switch under Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping to a more capitalist market economy and the dramatic economic growth that they've experienced as a result. I think it's obvious that there's only a very crude level of industrialization that you can accomplish through planned economic methods, and that at some point the market mechanisms were much more efficient at doing the things that needed to be done. But if you go back to Marx and Engels, the idea that capitalism will build the tools and the institutions of a new society inside the skin of the old. One of the interesting things I like pointing out is that Walmart, as an economy, is bigger than most of the national economies of the world, right? Walmart as a corporation. And Walmart has pioneered technologies like RFID coding that you put on all your products, which allow you to know exactly where everything is. They've also pioneered the idea of having predictive market analysis so that you know that because there's going to be a Super Bowl game with these two teams, that you're going to need lots of toilet paper with the Patriots in this place and a toilet paper with the other one on this place. And you do that weeks ahead of time, right? So that they're there when the people want it, right? You have to predict where the market's going. You have to then know that all that stuff got there with your RFID codes and your grand computer models of the Internet of Things. So Walmart, in a sense, internally is a planned economy that is far more efficient using these capitalist mechanisms under pressure from capitalism than any of the planned economies of the 1930s. And in a way, our capitalist democracies have all created institutions of cybernetic feedback and control of our economies, where hundreds of economic facts are being tallied and reported on a daily, weekly basis, and plugged back into countercyclical models of our central bankers, the investment decisions of our hedge fund managers, and so forth. And these forms of cybernetic control, in a way, are also a form of socialism, which, if you go far enough out on the right and you read their critiques of Western society, they're crying about socialist control in Western society all the time. I take that seriously. We are a half-socialized society to the extent that we have government attempting these kinds of counter-cyclical policies. Now, the final point about economics is to talk about technological unemployment. I'm a kind of a maximalist when it comes to technological unemployment. I think that eventually all jobs will fall prey to the fact that robots, automation, the Internet of Things, whatever, will do them better, faster, cheaper than human beings. And even if you still need a human being in the loop, you often don't need as many human beings in the loop, and therefore there will be a systematic decline in the proportion of jobs. The counter-argument is that actually the nature of jobs will change. That's one counter-argument. And another would be that these technological changes will free up all new kinds of employment that will absorb the people who are displaced by automation. And these may be, in fact, true. We don't actually have definitive evidence of technological unemployment occurring yet. Obviously, jobs are being made redundant all the time, but seeing an actual decline of the labor force participation rate that we can tie to technology is not yet occurred. What has occurred, and this is the labor force participation rate, starting here in 1970 at around 60% of the population, and reaching a peak around 2000 in 67 and a half or so. And then this dramatic decline in the 2000s, which started to level off here in the economic recovery that we've been in the last 5 years. And I and many others would argue that the next recession, the combination of technological innovations that are being made in a lot of different sectors and the next recession will push this labor force participation rate down. That would be actual evidence of technological unemployment. What most of this, about half of this, is the result of is the aging out of the labor force of the baby boomers that they have retired. And that's not something that's going to change either. We will see an increasing and a more dramatic in some places like China and Europe, where there's been a much lower fertility rate and where they have better healthcare systems, so they have better life expectancy. So there'll be a much more dramatic effect in what we call old age dependency ratio in those societies. But between old age dependency ratio, which we already knew was coming as a demographic given, and technological unemployment, we're going to, in the next decade or two, have to seriously renegotiate the way that we do labor, pensions, retirement, education, and income, and so forth. And I'm an advocate of universal basic income. So universal basic income is the idea that in a future, especially one of technological unemployment, even if we don't have technological unemployment, it's still a good idea for a variety of reasons, but especially in a future with technological unemployment and a changing dependency ratio in society, being able to tell everyone that they have some minimum floor of rights as citizens to not starve, and whether that's in combination with other social services like free education and free healthcare and so forth, which I do think would be a good idea, but to have some dollars coming to you all the time that is stimulative to the economy, but also gives you dignity as a citizen. I think that this is one of the things that's coming out of this period of people thinking about technological unemployment and the state of where capitalism is right now. So the final thoughts that I want to leave you with is, okay, if I just stopped there, I would have said AI, algorithms in governance are not a problem. It's only a problem if you don't have a transparent democratic government. If you're in that kind of situation, then everything that they do, whether it's algorithmic or not, is going to be bad. So fight for democracy, go forth and be a social justice warrior. But I don't think that's enough, because I think what we also need to be thinking about is how do we incorporate these algorithms and artificial intelligence into the democratic struggles that are being waged all over the world. What does it mean to have an algorithmically sophisticated or an automated or an artificial intelligent form of resistance, of citizen accountability, of citizen engagement? What would that look like? One example is surveillance, the bottom-up surveillance of society. Since the Rodney King beating 30 years ago, the fact that we have ubiquitous photos and sometimes streaming video images of police brutality, of the cordoning of protesters, of people saying things that then they have to regret and walk back or just ignore in the case of the current administration. But you know, this kind of bottom-up surveillance of society, this is one of the things that a lot of people in this sphere, like David Brin, wrote a book 30 years ago, arguing that it's impossible for us to really have privacy in the future, that there will be just so many forms of surveillance that we won't really have meaningful privacy. And what we need to ensure is that we have as much transparency of the people at the top from below as we do of people at the below from the top. That's what his argument for surveillance would be. Now, we're not there yet, obviously, but I think there are some interesting efforts. This is one, map the power. I did some urban power structure analysis in my youth. This is an attempt to crowdsource power structure analyses, corporate interlock, board data, those kinds of things, to show the connections. You know, this Russian oligarch can be connected to this Republican operative, can be connected to this administration official, and so forth. These kinds of bottom-up automations would be very helpful. Another is to use this nudge concept, because it doesn't have to be just for libertarian paternalism. It doesn't just have to be for governments trying to get you to do the things that they want you to do, like saving more of your income. It can also be to get you to vote. And one of the interesting experiments that's been done is just to inform everybody in a neighborhood who voted, right? Because it turns out when you know that half of your neighbors voted and that they know that you didn't vote, that's a huge nudge. And people sometimes they get really annoyed. It's like, why'd you tell everybody? It's public data, I'm sorry. It's just public data, I'm just making it clear to everybody. It's not China's social credit score system. I'm not saying you can't fly or go to college if you don't vote. I'm just telling everybody who voted and who didn't vote. I call this the name and shame approach. I think those kinds of things could have enormous political implications. Now, we live in such a partisan, bubbled world at this point that maybe it wouldn't. It's like, you know, maybe you only have friends who didn't vote who all think voting's irrelevant, and so maybe we'll be able to insulate ourselves to these kinds of pressures in the future. Now, forms of electronic democracy, experiments being done all over the world, but especially in Europe. This is an Icelandic platform called Active Citizen. It aggregates data from various sources that you tell it about public policy issues that you're interested in. It notifies you of public events, demonstrations, hearings, legislation, and so forth that you may want to engage with. It schedules your participation in various kinds of meetings and protests. So this is basically an electronic assistant for your activism, which I think is a great idea. Estonia has been doing amazing things in trying to transform all of its governance into an open source, transparent, completely digital architecture in ways that might horrify some of us. Everyone is obliged to carry an ID card that has a chip in it that has all your medical records on it, and so that every time you go to a hospital, they don't have to retest your blood type and so forth. But it has had enormous advantages for Estonia. It's estimated that it saved them 2% of their GDP by reducing the cost of human governance, right? Because they basically automated almost all the tasks. You can do everything that you want, get a visa, get a job application, get anything you want, you can do online in Estonia. So I think these are examples of the kind of electronification of democracy that would be very helpful. I won't try to walk you through all this, but this is from a recent report on digital democracy that articulates all the different kinds of experiments at every level of democratic expression. Issue framing, providing information, providing ideas, deliberation, scrutinizing proposals, making decisions, electronic budgeting processes where towns give people, fake chits and then have them create their own city budgets, and then they aggregate all the information back together and so forth. And we see in Europe, now this is not an entirely happy story yet, but we see in Europe experiments with digital populist parties, parties that form their platforms online, select their leadership and their parliamentary representations online. The German Pirate Party experimented with a platform called Liquid Feedback to do this. Italy's Five Star Movement has the platform Rousseau. And Spain's Podemos created a platform called Participia. Now, in the case of the 5-star movement, it not only generated some environmentalist proposals, but also some anti-immigrant proposals and also some anti-vaccination proposals. So it's not exactly the party that I would salute as the shining example. Podemos is falling apart because of internecine war, and the German pirates have shrunk into insignificance. But the fact that you have some initial experiments, I mean, the first time Robert's Rules of Order got trotted out someplace, I'm sure people were equally suspicious of its utility, but it turns out to have become dominant. So I think in the future, various forms of electronic participation, I mean, I'm a member of a political group here in Boston that just adopted as a part of its constitution that all members in Boston will be able to vote on all significant matters on the Boston area. So you don't have to actually go physically to a meeting, which is an enormous benefit for old boomers like myself who would prefer to just sit at home with couch lock in front of YouTube and vote online every once in a while on issues of my concern instead of actually go hang out with millennials. Okay, finally, and this is the most futuristic, I think we're headed into a future. You know about Elon Musk's Neuralink project, where he's trying to put neural mesh in people's heads. Something like this. Whether it's an app that you wear, it's in your phone, something like Active Citizen I was talking about. But we are not smart enough to be the kinds of democratic citizens that we want to be. Most people around the world, when faced with the prospect of actually having to participate in any significant fraction of the political decisions that actually affect their lives, would freak out and would much prefer to delegate that to representative democracy or sometimes authoritarian leadership, because it's just so overwhelming when people face these kinds of choices. The smarter that we get, I mean, you can see the progress of democracy partly as a progress of the spread of literacy and free time. That it used to be we didn't have a lot of free time and we didn't have a lot of literacy, and so the idea of democracy really was very abstract until the 20th century, and then it became increasingly real as people lived longer and could read and could actually parse issues. But we still don't have enough time to significantly parse all the issues that we have to face. And so the degree to which we get smarter, or what I call our exocortex gets smarter, that is the part of our brain that we've externalized into computing media, is also the degree to which our democracy will be strengthened. And if you're interested in fiction along these lines, Alistair Reynolds, science fiction writer, he wrote a novel about a society called the Demarcus, where they all have little processors in the back of their brain, which have a kind of repository of all their public policy preferences and knowledge, and in which the demos, the society that they live, is constantly sending them on a second-to-second basis decisions to make that they have to make collectively and democratically, but completely unconsciously. It's in communication with their brain, it's informed by their choices and what they would think if they had to, but they never have to actually think about it. They never actually have to vote because this thing in the back of their brain does it. That's what I think democracy might be headed towards. So my summary. Don't fear the algorithm. The algorithm is not the problem. The goal should be the democratization of algorithms, the democratization of the states that use algorithms, the creation of transparency in the use of algorithms, making sure that they're not biased, in the same ways that we have always attempted to make sure that bureaucracies are transparent and not biased. They are more, algorithms compared to bureaucracy are more efficient, more malleable, more transparent, and more accountable than the alternative. Bureaucracies still have human beings involved who can still do screwy things. Algorithms, once you get them tuned right, they work hopefully better. And I think automation and algorithms might, in fact, allow us to move more seamlessly towards the evolution towards a society where bureaucracy becomes increasingly, human bureaucrats at least, become increasingly powerless and shrink in size, and in which things are given to us as a part of an automated economy in ways that are better for human flourishing. I think a universal basic income and some of the possibilities of a more planned economy might go in those directions. So that's the basic thrust of this talk. How did I do in time? A little bit over, but okay. Yeah.
We needed a robot to keep track of you, not me, but I will turn this over to you guys for questions. Chris?
First, thanks for the talk.
Sure.
Tons of great stuff in there. Let me apologize also for jumping in front of students. I apologize because I'm going to take off.
Okay.
I have, I think, two quick questions. One is about the sort of model of bureaucracy that's driving much of the concern and structure of your arguments. And the question is very simple. I mean, bureaucracies are very good at routinized activities. AI algorithms at least seem very good at routinized activities, but we know from studies of street-level bureaucrats to high-level bureaucracies, they're very bad at novel situations. And I'm wondering if that same kind of difficulty will transfer into the techno-future you see with the, AIization of bureaucracies. So that's one question. The question that really worries me more, though, is about democracy. And I worry, I'm not sure I can formulate this quickly, but I'll try. Throughout the presentation, an idea keeps coming back that transparency is going to do work. That's going to do pro-democratic, pro-progressive. You're going to get better results. You're going to be able to check on people and stuff like that. And it just strikes me that there's a lot of ways in which we have incredible levels of transparency, and that transparency itself actually undermines the quality of democratic engagement and democratic deliberation and democratic decision making.
Because it's so overwhelming.
Because it's just, just think of like a privacy disclosure.
Right.
It's 23 pages long. You just got super transparency about what the privacy policy of Apple is, and you click, okay. Or alternatively, particular kinds of politicians love to be incredibly transparent. There's one who's in the office right now who's incredibly transparent about his motivations, but he just floods the airwaves so much with the miasma of information that it's actually seriously pathological for quality democratic decision making. So I'm worried about the recourse to transparency as a response to certain kinds of pathologies that we might predict in an AI future.
Well, I think Trump's example is interesting because there's no artificial intelligence involved when he gets up at 4 in the morning and starts tweeting. It's just his version of transparency. It also reminds me of Putin's logic of creating the simulacrum of democracy in Russia, that you can have lots of choices, and it all looks like it's democracy, but it isn't actual democracy. I think the question I would just come back to is what's the counterfactual for how you could have less AI and have a better outcome, right? It's possible to have a non-AI environment in which people are overwhelmed with data all the time, right? I think that's why I turned at the end towards this question of, is it possible to use algorithms and artificial intelligence tools to get a handle on what we really want to know, right? To distinguish the fluff, the wheat from the chaff in all the data. And that's an ongoing problem. I mean, I'm a statistician during my day job, and it's an ongoing problem in all the data that we have access to as here. When I go to the chancellor, he or she asks, tell me what I need to know, and I'm like, I'm drowning in information all the time. I have no idea what you need to know, So I hope that the evolution of tools will allow us to get past that false or faux transparency issue. But I definitely see what you're talking about.
And about the other question
And
about novel situations?
Novel situations.
Routinization?
Right. I mean, so with technological, with the automation of work, clearly we automate the things that are most routine first. And I did my doctoral work on the automation of medicine. And it's clear that you have that problem without robots in the automation of medicine. It's like, what things do you want to take to a generalist and what things do you want to take to a specialist? The generalist will miss some of the special circumstances of your particular condition. And you just have to kind of, at the population level, you just have to kind of say, well, that's acceptable in these circumstances and not in these. But there will always be type 1 and type 2 errors. There will always be computers that think they know what's going on and don't, and the ones that don't know what's going on and think they do, or whatever the reverse is. And I think that that's a matter of constant feedback from the system itself, is to figure out when it's misdiagnosing, when it's mischaracterizing data. And that's like the question with the lethal autonomous robotics, is when we use them in the field, and we are beginning to use them in the field, are there fewer civilian casualties? Are there fewer casualties of the targeted enemy combatants? Things like that.
No questions.
Oh yeah. I was just wondering. You mentioned what was it? Universal basic income in post-capitalism. But I was trying to connect the dots with if we do move towards that world with China and their Sesame credit score. Do you think that will become a possibility in America's society too?
I think it's important not to overemphasize the distinction between what China's doing and what already happens in the West. When we have credit scoring systems in the West, we have an online social media culture, call-out culture, reputation, likeism culture, that in some ways behaves in the way that China does. Have any of you seen Black Mirror episode about this? There's a Black Mirror episode about a future in which you have to have a certain number of social media credit likes in your bank account in order to fly a plane or do anything. And the terrible day that this woman has as she loses all of her credit points and has to basically walk to a wedding. But so I think that there are ways in which the West is already there. And in some ways, and another science fiction author I would point you to is Cory Doctorow, who wrote a novel 20 years ago, Down Out in the Magic Kingdom, about how to have an anarcho-socialist future with what he called WUFI, or a reputation economy. And everyone would basically have their social credit score floating above their head, and if people liked your joke at a party, they would give you some credits, and your credit score would go up, and you could spend it on various kinds of activities. And over the course of the last 20 years, Cory has become horrified by his own idea because he's seen what it could turn into in places like China. And so he's gone in an even more anarcho direction. But I think that there is a certain appeal. And I say this because I'm also working on the topic of moral enhancement. And I think from the perspective of moral enhancement, there are many ways in which, to give you an example, there's a critique in left social science of the capitalist exploitation of emotion. That basically certain workers in jobs like airline attendants or service workers, they are paid to be nice, even if they don't feel nice. And that this is supposedly building up a certain amount of stress in them and is a form of labor exploitation. I don't see the evidence for it. What I see the evidence for is that when people feel angry and they actually act nice, it's actually good for their mental health. It makes them happier in general, right? So for me, if there's social pressure on all of us to be nice, and people are going to, like in China, they will now take a picture of your face when you jaywalk on the street and then put it up on public billboards and say, these are all the people who jaywalked today. And they'll identify you by name and say, look out for Joe because he jaywalked today. Now, I don't want that. But I think, to the extent that when someone, kills a dog and puts it on YouTube or whatever, when people find out who that is and name and shame them, I think there are some benefits that we should look to for the creation of some of the intimacies of the small town that we lost when we went to the big city, right? When we went to the big city, you could get away with anything because no one would ever hold you accountable. Now, because of this big data and citizen surveillance, we're beginning to recreate some of that intimacy. I think this is why it appeals to China, this notion, and why it's not so disturbing to them, the totalitarian implications. It's because it reintroduces the level of kind of citizen accountability that they feel they've lost.
And I had one more question. It was on the dangers of AI. When you brought up at the start saying you were, I forget what the word was, but for like human enhancements.
Transhumanist?
That you thought that that's like a good way to move forward, or you believe in that type of thinking. I know Elon Musk, he started his Neuralink, and one of the reasons for that was because AI could be so dangerous that he believes that we could beat them by doing that. Do you have any? Could you like elaborate on your views on that subject?
Yeah. Well, Werner Vinci actually frames it quite well in his essay on The Singularity, which he wrote for NASA back in 1991, where he lays out the Moore's law trajectory of algorithmic growth and says what Kurzweil and others now say, that we will probably have desktop, human-level intelligent computers by 2040, 2045, something like that. And that no matter how complicated the coding is to create consciousness, we'll probably have something like human consciousness by the 2040s in our computers. I think it might come a lot sooner than that. I'm sorry, I lost the train of my thought. What was your question about?
Pretty much what was your view on the whole...
Oh, okay, intelligence augmentation, got it. And so Werner Vinci, when he wrote this essay that launched this whole singularity idea, he argued that the alternative to staying up for human beings to stay on top of what was happening and not get crushed by artificial intelligence was human intelligence augmentation through various kinds of enhancements. And I think it's too narrow just to think about it as stuff that we surgically implant in our head. And we probably will never have a lot of people with things surgically implanted. The direction things are headed is that we'll be able to take a pill, it will unwrap itself in our gut or our blood, travel through the blood-brain barrier, start building and replicating itself in the brain. We're decades away from doing that safely, but that's the direction things are probably headed for actual neural nano interfaces. But we have, in so many other ways that we have to pay attention to, the exocortical versions of those things, right? That's why you can't ignore, would it make a real difference or would it be any advantage if my fitness tracker was actually implanted in my body? I don't think so, right? Then I would have to actually get surgery in order to get it upgraded. So in a lot of ways, what we're worried about are things that are going to happen around the body and not in the body. But I do think that eventually they'll be in the body as well. Yeah. Other questions?
I'll take a turn.
Okay.
So this is the conversation we've been having for a while, Jay. Maybe I've sharpened my question a little bit. So I share the optimistic premises and sometimes the optimistic conclusions and sometimes not. So the optimistic premise being this stuff really works and actually works better and better and outperforms humans and allocation of resources, outperforms humans, and allocation of police forces, outperforms them, and punishment outperforms them, and a bunch of things. And I guess some questions about whether that always leads to, whether there can be some sort of significant unforeseen consequences of that. So one example, which you probably, or most of us probably won't think is a big loss, World War I, a real entrance of automation, as it were, into warfare with massive adoption of automatic weaponry, which was beginning in the Civil War, but really sort of mainstreamed in World War I. And by the time that war ends, the kind of classical idea of military virtues, of glory, of courage, of the dulce decorum est pro patria more, like the poet says, is gone, because people die like flies in the face of automation, and it's never quite recovered. And part of the reason why it's never quite, there's just new versions of it, right? Can you really call a drone pilot brave in any sense if they're flying a mission over Afghanistan and from Arizona and so on and so forth? So that's a sense of human ways of being good at something, which is gone. Now, it happens to be human ways of being good at war, and maybe that's not a great loss that we now don't have that excuse for glorifying people, right? But you can think about other contexts where something similar, where a similar sort of virtue loss, if you want, happens. Say something like big data tracking of our sleep, big data tracking of other health aspects, and all of a sudden you become the subject of this massive data collection, and you're kind of a healthy person overall, and you have detailed information of when you enter REM sleep, when you leave it, and you're like, all anxious, did I have enough REM sleep tonight? And something's, you kind of start taking yourself a little too seriously because you become the subject of all of this information collection, and some sense of humility, some sense of a tendency to concentrate on the world rather on yourself is lost. So I guess my question to you is, in a long-winded way, do you have worries about unintended consequence of the success rather than the failure of these things?
Sure. Well, let's start with the virtue question. It's a fascinating example. I personally am not terribly broken up about the fact that martial virtue has declined. Right. I don't know how much to credit machine guns with that versus, I suppose it is more sexy to stick somebody with a sword than shoot them with a machine gun. But I think the fact that virtues change, human virtues change, is a more general problem in the field of metaethics, which is how do we know whenever we have progress? And people like Sam Harris have hilariously attempted to wait, and everybody knows Sam Harris is the new atheist neuroscientist. He wrote a book a couple of years ago where he basically argued that it was self-evident that European social democracy was the pinnacle of human civilization, and therefore all good should flow from that assessment. And how could anyone possibly disagree? And it's like, well, the Taliban disagree, ISIS disagrees, there's all kinds of people disagree with your assessment about that. And that's because we don't all have the same ethical priorities. I think, when I say techno-progress, it's within a specific Enlightenment context about what does it mean to have social or technological progress. For me, the technological progress is basically the expansion of the realm of human freedom from necessity. Being able to die when you want, being able to not get sick, being able to think the thoughts that you want, and so forth. And the social and political freedom is having as much control in the hands of ordinary citizens over the decisions that affect their lives. But one of the things that comes along with that, for instance, as you point out, is the paradox of choice. So the more choices we have, the more unhappy we are with all the consequences of our choices. The more kinds of potato chips we have to choose from, the less we'll enjoy the potato chip that we choose. The more electronic dating options we have, the more dissatisfied and second-guessing we will do about every date that we go on and every person that we marry. Our marriages will get shorter and less satisfied once we know that we've ruled out the other 500,000 people that we could have chosen. So that's just a fact of modern life. And I think we're constantly adapting to this. Like when I really enjoyed shopping at Sam's Club because they only had one of everything. And I never had to think about price. If I wanted peanut butter, this was the peanut butter. If I wanted coffee, this was the coffee. And that made me happy, right? Because I don't like having to do all that parsing on a moment-to-moment basis. We will have to learn both psychologically to adapt to the proliferation of choice and also to use our tools to parse out. So, when you turn off people in your Facebook news feed, you're basically making a choice. You're saying, I don't need to hear anything more about that, right? That person, the things that they're interested in, just don't show me that. That's the use of a tool to reduce the amount of overwhelming choice in our lives. So I think we're going to have an increasing proliferation of those tools and those psychological capacities. There's some evidence that millennials and Generation Z are already better at multitasking than us senior citizens are. So hopefully that will continue in the future.
Any other comments, questions? There you go.
I guess I have two questions. One would be sort of touching on what Professor Sikovitz talked about with martial valor, but more in general, like, so if you have universal basic income and automation or whatever does all the work, where does that leave people? Some people would probably be fine with just doing their hobby and enjoying life or whatever, but I feel like a lot of people need a vocation or like to feel needed in a way. Like what would become of those sort of people, one? And also you touched on AI systems that have come up with like racist results, for example, and that's a problem of like garbage in, garbage out, and you would need to I guess filter what would go into the system. I feel like there's there's still an arbitrary component of AI then that it's sort of meant to solve. So like I don't know, like let's say, and you talked about the necessity for like liberal democratic values, and so what if, I don't know, Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? They're both Islamic countries, but Iran is Shia and Saudi Arabia is Wahhabi. So what if they used AI to enforce Sharia, but then they'd still get different results, and both results would obviously not really be in line with our values.
Okay, so the first one is about work. There's a long strain of thought about this in the last 200 years. Most people, right and left, have valorized work and the necessity to work. And then there's a smaller strain of people like myself who basically don't think that human beings need work as it's currently constituted, wage slavery, as I would put it. I think if you look historically, whenever the human race started, say 1 million years ago, 50,000 years ago, whatever point you want, the vast majority of human history, most of us didn't have jobs, right? We had things we had to do in order to survive. And some estimate that they probably didn't take 40 hours a week, all those very necessary things. And then the rest of the things that we did because they were part of our local group, sang songs, told each other stories, took care of kids or whatever. And so I think one of the things is we have to kind of decolonize our imagination about what it means to have meaningful occupation. For the last 2,500 years, 5,000 years, and since there have been aristocrats, people who didn't have to work, those aristocrats, for the most part, have not committed suicide. It would be a very different society if they had. If ennui was so overwhelming of not having a daily necessary occupation that you would commit suicide. Most of them didn't. They found things to do. They had roles, social roles that had developed within their societies. I think it's quite possible to imagine that that you could wake up in the morning and say, what I have to do today, the person I am is this, and what I have to do today to contribute to society and to my own life goals is to do X. And it might not have anything to do with getting paid a wage, right? That is just because you chose to do it. And then there's a significant proportion of the population that already live that way, right? As I said, only 60% of the population is in paid wage labor in the United States, and it used to be less. So I think once we decolonize our imagination about what it means to have occupations, yes, it will be a problem if people do not make that transition to finding what their life goals should be and having new self-images of what they're supposed to do. I don't get up every day, since for the last 2 years at any rate, since the 2016 election, I get up every day and have a specific set of thoughts about how I'm going to change the world. I turn on NPR to see if it's already happened, and then I start working on my day. It's not about the paid labor that I have to do that day. I get to that eventually, but my first thought is my role as a citizen. So I think it's quite possible to imagine that. Now, the second part of your question was what?
So basically, about how there have been AI systems that have had problems per se.
Yeah, Islamic AI, I think that's, by the way, that's an example I actually used in my book, Citizen Cyborg, is because of this meta-ethical problem. There's no guarantee that if we were to to have artificial intelligence ethics assistance, in fact, we could guarantee that there will be multiple versions of it. There will be a Christian version of it, there will be various Islamic versions of it, there will be left-wing and right-wing versions of it, and so forth. And how do we parse how people use those and how governments use those? Now, as I said, the problem with what China's doing is not that they're giving people the tools of citizen surveillance and citizen dinging of uncitizen-like behavior, right? I think that might actually have, within certain limits, certain constraints, might actually be okay. It's that they're doing it in a totalitarian way. Similarly, if Saudi Arabia or Iran were to apply such things, I think it would be in a totalitarian way. But if someone were to have an app, you already have apps that tell you which direction Mecca is. You already have Bible apps and Quran apps and Mark's quotes of the day. I mean, people have apps that are attempting to change their moral behavior. So, if you had an app that you could ask, is you know, is lobster bisque tray for kosher, I don't think that that's immoral. You know, I don't think that's a threat to the future of society. If Israel insists that every restaurant run the app before they put a menu together, that would be a totalitarian thing to do, right? So I don't know if that addresses your question.
It does a little bit, but I think the main point of my first question was you pointed like to aristocrats who didn't have to work, but I think it doesn't really address the same sort of issue, since with AI and all this, there might really not be anything that humans have to do. Like, these aristocrats still ran government and felt important and had still important jobs to do, even if it wasn't a wage job or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And my second one, I think the main point.
Well, just let me pause there. Graeber's got a new book out, Bullshit Jobs. I don't know. Basically, he argues that a quarter, a third of all jobs in modern capitalist societies are pointless. Now, this is kind of, most left-wing economists wouldn't agree with this. The left-wing economists would say, well, like the right-wing, why would you have a job? Why would you pay somebody to do something if it's actually pointless? You know, that capitalism should weed out that kind of inefficiency. But he's arguing that basically capitalism finds it to be stabilizing to pay some people to do things which are basically pointless. And in the same way that the rise of unemployment insurance and trade union rights and shorter work weeks and so forth was a way of stabilizing capitalism, having counter-cyclical dollars going back into the economy. He's arguing that pointless jobs play a function in our society, but that they're soul-draining. And when he points to data like asking British men whether they think that society would be better off if their job didn't exist, and a quarter of them say yes. Now, it's possible that, you know, that we would wake up one day and not have wage labor and not be able to find meaningful work, right? And even if the government were to pay us $1 a day to go dig a ditch and fill it back up, that we would still feel that that was a bullshit job and that there was no point in that. And this is one of the reasons why I've argued against right-to-job proposals. I think, you know, maybe transitionally, but eventually right-to-job will have the same fiscal and kind of legitimacy constraints that any kind of public employment does. Is why am I paying my good tax dollars for you to dig a ditch when I could have this robot over here dig it for, you know, 100th of the cost and more efficiently? So yes, there will be, if people are invested in particular kinds of occupations and those occupations become redundant, they will either have to adapt or be depressed. That's just going to happen, and that's happened in every generation. But I think there are so many possibilities of human fulfillment that if we start looking ahead and training people with good liberal arts educations that, you know, give them the skills to enhance themselves when they find themselves in that situation. All that said, the last time I actually had to look for a job, I was terrified, and my therapist told me that I should just stay home and write books, and I said, screw that, I need paid employment. So I talk out of both sides of my mouth. But
All right. Jay, thank you so much.
yeah. So again, this paper is online, Journal of Posthuman Studies. You all have access to it, and I can send you the slides if you're interested.